Start the recording. So I would say welcome to Curriculum Instruction. It is April 23rd. I had to 8 o'clock. I couldn't remember the date, so that's how my quarantining is going. April 23rd. It's 10 o'clock. This is Curriculum and Instruction class. Things we're going to accomplish today. First, I'll open up if anybody has any questions about like the Competency 8 assignment, the UBD versus project-based learning comparison. I was pretty broad. If we were face-to-face in a classroom, it would have been easier, I think, to do that. But the broadness of the assignment, I know, got to some folks. So if you have questions about that, we'll open that up here at the beginning. If there are any final questions about the competencies 1 through 4, I can ask those. I know that I'd given feedback for that, but I haven't looked at what's been turned back in based on the feedback. So if there are final questions that you have on that, I'm happy to answer those. And if by chance there's something still off about one of those assignments, I will certainly give it back to you. And we have all the way through finals week to get everything up to snuff. So that's the plan for the first part of the day. After we get done with that, we're going to introduce our final competency, which is essentially constructing your first lesson plan. And in order to do that, we'll let you kind of sift through some lesson plan templates, some sample lesson plans. I will break down kind of what I call the granddaddy of them all as far as lesson plans go, which is the Madeline Hunter style lesson plan. And then after you guys have had a chance to kind of sift through those and I've explained that a little bit, we'll introduce the competency assignment. And then I'll stay on at the end if you have any questions about that or any other questions that you want to ask one-on-one as I let you go. So that's the general plan for today. So before we do lesson planning, are there other questions, anything about Competency 8 that you weren't quite sure of? Again, we made it pretty broad, and that may have been a mistake, so we might have to address that. But some people weren't even, they were unaware, not unaware, they did not know what to compare. And that makes sense to me as looking at the assignments. They weren't sure what we wanted to compare. Do you have any questions about that? Questions about the assignment in general? Here's some time.
Okay, Dr. Dimmitt.
Yes.
So that was exactly where my problem was. I couldn't find exactly what I was comparing and what to look for, I guess.
Yep, that makes sense. And we should have done a better job, or I should have done a better job at letting you know what those things were. Here's what I would do if I were you. And you're free to take this advice or not. But I would look at how each of those units begins. How do we draw kids into the unit? I would look at how each of those units is assessed. So is there a difference in assessment between like the project-based learning unit and the understanding by design unit? And I guess spoiler alert is there could be differences, but they also could be the same. You could do a project-based learning unit as a backward design unit, but not all backward design units are project-based. So that might be something that you would fold into the comparisons that you would do. And I also might look at the day-to-day lessons that would be offered in those style of units. You know, are there differences or are there similarities between how those units are offered on lesson plans from day to day? So those are 3 things I would look at. How do they start? How are they assessed? And how do you look at them lesson planning for day to day? And if you can do those things, that's good for me.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I should have done a better job at explaining that, and I didn't, and I apologize. So take those suggestions and use them if you want or not, but you know, when you get it done, turn it in. There's no, what is time really in quarantine? The only thing that I would say is that if you could do it by the 29th of April, I'd appreciate it. Just because that gives me that week then during what would normally be finals week to make sure that it's on the right track. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Other questions? That's an excellent question. And I apologize again.
I also have a question, Dr. Dimmitt.
Okay, sure.
So with other assignments, if something is incorrect or can be improved, will you let us know so that we're able to make those?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
So
I really appreciate that.
Oh, no worries. That's my general rule of thumb, even without quarantine, but it's especially in this time that we're living through. And that's another reason why some of the excess stuff, I just have kind of cut that out, just because I think it's really important to focus on the competencies only and what we can do for the competencies. So, and actually that's a segue into the lesson planning stuff. When I introduce the lesson plan to you, I'm the final thing. We can work on it all the way up until the last Friday of finals week. And off the top of my head, I can't remember when that is. It's the week after the 29th of April. So would it be like May 6th or something? So you've got that time if you need it, but I'm going to make kind of things due along the way as much as I can. So I'm going to introduce the lesson planning stuff today. I'm going to, theoretically, I'm going to make you turn in a preliminary plan on the 26th, which is this Sunday. If it's not completely done, that's okay. I just want to see what you've got, and it kind of forces you to work a little bit along the way. The final plan then will be due on the 29th of April, but even that's not final. If there's something wrong that needs to be fixed, I'll give it back. So the what do they say on TL, DL, whatever that means, too long, didn't read. The long story short is that as much as possible, we will get you through, and I'll extend all the stuff out to the very end just to make sure that you pass all the competencies. That's the most important thing, passing the competencies so you can pass the course. So that's what we do. Other questions? Very good.
I have one.
Sure.
For the competency 8, what I did was I looked at the PowerPoints of the backwards learning, and then I looked at the PowerPoint of the project-based learning,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't necessarily like compare and contrast like two lesson plans from each one,
Mm-hmm.
but what I did was I looked at like the core, like, I guess, understandings of both of them, and I compared and contrasted that as a whole. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So
Okay. I just didn't know if you wanted us to do the whole like lesson plan or not.
No. So here's the deal. I can't remember exactly what the competency says, but basically it boils down to, can you differentiate between the two plans? Do you know a little bit about each of those plans? And what you just said to me, and I'll be honest, I haven't looked at what you've turned in yet, but what you just said to me right there tells me that you do know the difference between those two plans. You can articulate the differences and how they're the same. That's what we're going for.
Oh, okay. Okay.
The end result then would be, as you unit plan and as you lesson plan and all that sort of thing, do you know enough about each of those things so that when you're out in the real world, whatever that means, can you build lessons to each of those styles? That's the trick. So,
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right. So let's kind of get into it here. If you don't have the course website pulled up, I would invite you to do that, because I'm going to show you where to find some stuff for what we're going to do today. We're in week 5 here. Yeah, sorry, I'm having a little brain freeze for a second. Yeah, it's week 5, and what you're going to need to really look at today are these things called lesson plan templates. So if you're in the week 5 module, eventually you're going to click on lesson plan templates, and there are going to be 5 of these things that pop up. And in a few moments, I'm going to put you into some smaller groups, probably 3 or 4 in each group. And what I'm going to ask you to do is basically just kind of sift through these and find what they're similar in, what they're different in, and see if any one of these pops out at you as far as the ones that you want to use in designing your own lesson plan. But before that, we're going to do kind of a quick intro to lesson planning. I need to share my screen. Hang on. Okay, so let's do like maybe 5 to 7 minutes on lesson planning. And if we were all in class together, if we were face to face, then I would use this particular activity as something that in lesson planning is called an anticipatory set. I would begin the lesson with this, and we would try to kind of get into a mindset of what it is that we're going to do with lesson planning. So just for kicks, and because the word anticipatory set is going to come up a little bit later, I'm going to read through this. We're not going to actually do the activity, but this is how it would kind of get us started. So it says, last week we spent time working with curriculum maps and unit plans. This week we're going to begin discussing lesson plans. For our first activity today, we're going to do a quick draw. For the quick draw, this is what I would ask you to do. Create a representation of the relationship between a curriculum map, a unit plan, and a lesson plan. How do those things relate to each other? A curriculum map, a unit plan, and a lesson plan. If we were face-to-face, I'd give you probably not 5 minutes, but a few minutes to do that drawing. Then we'd come back as a whole group from those small groups and try to sift through what we had learned. And then ultimately, hopefully, you would kind of come to this conclusion about how these things relate to each other. And if you remember, we looked at the curriculum map as that thing on the wall that had all of the units laid out from August to May, what standards were assessed, and what each individual unit title was in the framework of all of those standards. And then you come to the individual unit plan, which is a subset of that curriculum map or part of that scope and sequence. And then at last today, we kind of start to talk about that idea of a lesson plan. So it becomes kind of like this funnel, the biggest thing down to the smallest thing, the year stuff down to the unit stuff, down to the day-to-day. And that's what a lesson plan is. It is kind of the daily roadmap, if you will, of what you will do each day to ensure that you're going to meet what students need to know about the standards that are set forth. And of this slide, I know you can read, but I'm going to read this particular section to you because I think it's pretty important. Daily lesson plans require us to think about how we're going to meet the individual needs of students in our classroom. I'm going to stop the share for just a second so I can see all of, not really your faces, but the names that you're throwing out at me here. So the important thing about lesson plans, there's multiple important things about lesson plans, but I'm going to start with a little bit of a disclaimer, and that is that when I was a classroom teacher, and many of the teachers in the School of Ed, and many teachers doubtless everywhere, if you ask us flat out, did we do a formalized lesson plan for every single day of class that we walked in, for every class that we ever taught? And the answer to that is no. However, we feel like it's really important for you to learn the components of a good lesson plan so that you know how to construct one, and so that then as in your career as a classroom teacher, you can pick and choose from those important components of the plan so that you can construct a lesson plan for your classes every day. Is it important to have a 100% Madeline Hunter style lesson plan for every day that you teach? The answer is no. But it is tremendously important for you to have a plan written down, I would say, of what you're going to teach every day for multiple reasons. One is, as an administrator, if I were to come into your classroom and I would ask, what's your instructional plan for the day? If you can't show that to me, then that's a red flag for me as your administrator, because that tells me that if you're not focused on what you're going to teach, that your students aren't going to be focused either. And that's really important in the framework of your classroom to make sure that your students are focused on what needs to be learned. And the other thing I would say that's important about a lesson plan itself is if you don't write stuff down, as good as your memory might be, you are not going to remember everything about what it was you were supposed to teach. And that's important in the framework of the class itself, so you can refer back to it. But it's also important in the long term of how you reflect on your success or lack of success as an educator. How do you know what you were supposed to teach if you don't write it down? How can you reflect accurately on being a practitioner in your classroom if you don't have it written down? So that's the reason, among many reasons, that lesson plans are really important to do. Do they have to be done exactly the way that we're going to show you for every class? No, they don't. But for our purposes, for right now, we want you to do them like this so that you're aware of the components of a traditional lesson plan. So that's the kind of the end of my spiel on that. But that's the reason. If you're asking what the reason is, that's the reason. So now what we're going to do, we're going to examine some lesson plan formats. I'm going to put you into smaller groups, give you about 10 minutes to sift through those particular plans that I showed you. I'll show you how to get back there again in just a second. It says divide in groups of 4. I'll try to make it groups of 4. It may be groups of 3. I'm going to go to week 5 module. There are actually 5 different lesson plans that are found there. And so in your group, kind of look at what's the same and what's different about those plans. So again, let me share the right screen with you. After I put you into the smaller groups, you're going to go into week 5, the week 5 module of your course website, and click on lesson plan templates. And you're going to look at what's called the 5E plan. You're going to look at something called the Modified Hunter Lesson Plan. And again, Madeline Hunter is kind of one of the first recognized education gurus, and the plan that she created is widely used across the world. And you're going to look at some other plans as well. Stop the share there for a second. I'm going to pause our recording. So as we come back from that, I think if I had to put into like one word what the 8 a.m. section kind of said about what they saw was just overwhelming. That was the general term for what they had thought today. Any thoughts along those same lines, or any similarities that you noticed between the plans, or anything like that?
For the music teaching and the PE lesson, those were the two that I thought were pretty overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
Towards the end, they got better and more organized, I thought, but at the beginning, it was kind of hard to figure out where's what, and
yeah,
it just looked overwhelming.
For my own, and you're free to use whichever plan that you want. For my own personal preference, I've always been a Madeline Hunter kind of person. Not that I used every single component of the Madeline Hunter plan, and I'll try to, as we break that down, I'll tell you what I used maybe and what I didn't use. But I just like it's very linear to me. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end, and it makes more sense to me in the way that I think. Math and science folks tend to gravitate toward the 5E plan. If you're a math person in particular, I believe that your math people will steer you. They may even make you do a 5E plan when they have you do lesson plans in their content area classes. And I think maybe the same for science as well. If you're elementary, it's kind of, wherever you prefer. I've seen elementary plans that are 5E plans. I've seen them that are Hunter plans, and there are other ones obviously that you can take a look at as well. So it does depend a lot on your personal preference. The only thing that we would ask that whichever plan that you choose, you make sure that all the sections are filled out, because that's best practice. That's what we would ask you to do, with the understanding that when you head into your classrooms, as we've talked about, it may not be possible to do that for every single subject that you teach every single day, and that's okay. But it's important to have the underlying knowledge of what's actually going on with those plans, so that you can speak to that if you're called on. So let's break down the Hunter plan, and then I'll introduce you to the assignment, overall assignment. And the reason that I choose to break down the Hunter plan is twofold. One is because it's the one that I'm most familiar with, but also it's kind of the bedrock of all of the lesson plans that come out. The Hunter plan has a lot of similarities to other plans that are coming out. So if we can understand what the Hunter plan brings us, we can probably understand the other plans as well. Okay, so let's just kind of break down some of the components of the Hunter lesson plan. If you want to, there's advice that comes on this PowerPoint. If you want to, you can call up the Hunter plan on your own computer screens, and as I'm going through, you can take a look. If not, that's fine, but that's an option that you would have. Okay, so for every lesson plan that you do, we're going to ask you, for us, to have a title. And it says, just like it says, the title should convey the topic of the lesson plan. It should also be engaging to students. And flat out, if you asked me, did I have a title on every lesson plan that I ever gave for every class that I taught? The answer to that is no. But it's a good idea to kind of think about it in that way. And your title, if you do choose to title a plan, and for us, we're going to make it, but if you as an educator in your classroom choose to title them, I would suggest you don't title it April 7th, Social Studies, because when you go back in the future and look at what you've done, April 7th, Social Studies is going to be nothing to you. So rather than April 7th, Social Studies, you might call it Opening of the Great Depression, something like that, so that you have a framework of reference for what you're going to do. And it says it should be engaging to students. Well, that assumes that you tell the students the title of your lesson plans. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But the title, I would say, if you choose to do it, ultimately, it's got to be meaningful to you. And April 7th, Social Studies is probably not going to cut it. Time frame, it's probably not a bad idea to put a time frame. And again, we're going to make you do that for us, but probably not a bad idea to put a time frame on there, so that as you look back through your lesson plans, as you're planning for the future, you know that if you budget a half an hour for this, you've got other things that you need to accomplish in the framework of the time that you have available. So that's probably not a bad idea. And on this particular slide, the one that I would absolutely suggest that you want to do is the materials needed. And the reason for that is that your future self will thank your past self if you do this, because that way you don't have to continuously look through every element of the lesson plan to figure out what you need every year. You can just look back through and say, oh, when I did this, I need chart paper and markers, and we need a timer. And then you can secure those things before you even do it. You don't even have to worry about it. You already just know. So that's advice that I would give you on that. And again, for our purposes in here, we're going to make you do those things with the understanding that when you get into your classroom, that's not going to happen every day. Next thing, every lesson plan that you teach, however you choose to write it down, however you choose to address it, every lesson plan that you teach in your classroom should be connected to a standard in some way. The GLE or the standard, and from state to state, depending on where you end up, it may be called a little bit different, but every lesson plan should be connected to a standard. And furthermore, you should be able to articulate that standard that you're teaching to whomever asks you. So if your students ask you, and I don't know, I taught for a long time, and I don't know that I ever had a student ask me what standard we were looking at that day, but I did have parents and I did have my administrators ask me. And as an administrator, when I went through, I would always ask teachers, hey, what standards are you looking at today? What are you teaching? So you should always be able to articulate that to make sure that if we go back to that first graphic we looked at, make sure that you're connected to the unit plan through the standards, and making sure ultimately that you're connected to that curriculum map, the scope and sequence through the standards. So you should always be able to speak to the standards that you're teaching on that particular day. Because we know through the principles of assessment class that the standards help us establish teacher learning objectives. And you already have done that in the principles of assessment. You created those objectives based on the standards, and then you created the I can statements. And that's what we're going for here. You should always then use those objectives and I can statements to connect to your lesson planning so that you know what you want your students to accomplish on that particular day. And that should always be tied back to the unit, which in turn should always be tied back to that scope and sequence. So that it's not just you walking into your classroom one day and going, what should I teach about today? I think we'll do this. Okay, that is not best practice, and that, in fact, will get you to be a non-teacher fairly quickly if that's what you choose to do. So now there's some stuff in this PowerPoint that if you choose to go back through it, I would advise you to just ignore it. Maybe if we had more time, I could teach you about the ABCD model of objective writing, but quite honestly, we already wrote objectives in the principles of assessment class, and I don't know that we need to rehash that. So anything that talks about ABCD stuff, if you're worried about that, I wouldn't. Just ignore it and don't worry about it. But do think about the objectives and the I can statements that you're going to put onto your lesson plan, okay? So now, as you get to the actual lesson planning itself, Madeline Hunter calls it the anticipatory set. If it's a 5E plan, I believe the first E on the 5E plan is engagement, okay? How is it that you get your kids into the framework of the lesson that you're going to teach them on this particular day? Okay, so if you remember for us today, if we would have been face-to-face, we would have done the 5-minute quick draw about how those 3 components related to each other: curriculum map, unit plan, and lesson plan. That was my anticipatory set for today. That's how I would get us engaged in the content that was coming, okay? How do you get your students into it? Madeline Hunter, bless her heart, would say that you need to script this, meaning that like everything that you say should word for word be written down in your anticipatory set plan. I am not suggesting that. I am just saying that you need to have some sort of an opening activity, a reading selection. It could even be, hey class, yesterday we did X. Remember X? Well, today we're going to take X and turn it into Y, okay? Something like that. How is it that you engage your students into the classroom setting that particular day? So now
Dr.
the next,
Dimmitt,
yes, go ahead.
I have a question about that.
Yes, absolutely.
Could that be something like establishing relevance, like telling your students why it's important that you're learning this?
Yeah, absolutely.
And, like
Yeah.
get them excited about that?
Yep,
Would that
absolutely.
be in that sort of section?
That is where you would do that. You know, we're going to learn about this because whatever the reason, you know, and
Okay.
that's
Okay.
anticipatory. You get them into
Okay.
it by saying that. Yep.
Yeah, because I'm thinking with like high schoolers, lots of times they want to know like why it's important.
Why?
And since that's what I want
How
to
are you
teach,
ever going
like
to
why
use
do I
this?
have to learn this, that sort of thing. Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep. Yeah, that was my, actually, you must have had a Wayback Machine to go into my math classroom when I was in high school. What are we going to need this for? Mrs. Astor, what are we going to need this? Well, you know, turns out I needed it to actually get a good grade, which I didn't in math. So That was the immediate response that she should have given me. But anyway. So the next part then of the plan, and it looks different in different plans, but there's a lot of similarities. Hunter calls it the I do, we do, you do. And that implies there's a gradual release of responsibility from being completely in the hands of the teacher to ultimately giving it out to the students, okay? So that the students can master the skills for themselves. The teacher theoretically has got it, and then through explanation, modeling, guided practice, and individual practice, that responsibility then goes and is released out to the students. That's essentially why you're doing your lesson plan. How do you get the knowledge from you to them, okay? Or how do you help them create that knowledge for themselves? That's the purpose of the plan. So just in general, the I do represents the first thing after the anticipatory set that the teacher is going to do to instruct the students. That's the I do. I'm going to tell you about this thing. We do, then we together are going to practice this thing, whatever the thing is, and then you do. You by yourself or with a partner or whatever are going to practice this thing individually without my help, but I'm still going to maybe come around and check on you for your understanding. That's the general components of a lesson plan. It'll have different maybe different terminology from plan to plan, but almost every plan that you look at is going to be organized in that way. Teacher does it, students practice it, students do it on their own. Okay, how is it that you can get them to that point? And then if you look back through this, you can kind of see how these steps are broken down. What does the teacher do? The idea of modeling. What do they do together? The we do is teachers and students do the activity together. Checking for understanding, so that as you've done the activity together, how is it that you can actually ask your students if they understand what's going on? One of the ways is literally, show of hands. Do you understand what's happening? Fist to 5, 0 to 5, thumbs up. Other ways to check for understanding: exit tickets at the end of the class. Something called reciprocal teaching, where you have students then turn to each other and talk about what you just talked about. Any of those ways is an idea to check understanding. Okay? Small groups, and there are some other examples in here too. And you can kind of check back for that. And then ultimately, again, you want the students doing the activity independently. So then, after all of that happens, the I do, we do, you do, then you got to figure out some way to assess whether your students actually know what's happening for that particular day. Do they get the standard down that you wanted them to get down? And remember, from principles of assessment, assessment means at the end of the unit, but you should be assessing throughout the unit too. And that's what this means in terms of the lesson plan. How is it that you can formatively assess your students so that you know whether what you've planned and what you wanted them to learn has stuck? Formative assessment strategies. Formative is the big deal for this. You can look for some of those assessments on the sample lesson plans that we've given. You can kind of think back to some of the stuff that you've seen personally, or you can use some of those examples that I just gave to you. And then the last thing that we talk about in terms of a lesson plan, and it's called different things throughout different lesson plans, different styles of plans, but there's always some way, or there should always be some way to achieve what's called closure at the end of the lesson. How do you wrap it up? How do you say, okay, here's what we were going to learn about. Here are some of the things that we did, and ultimately here are how the things we did fit into what the thing is that we wanted to learn about. That's closure in some way. And it could literally be just saying at the end what I just did. Here was our objective for the day. Here's how we tried to accomplish the objective, and here's this exit ticket, for instance, where you as a student can judge how well you think you accomplished the objective. So somehow you're going to have to tell them what they were supposed to have learned, going back to the original class objective, summarize what you've done, and then let them go and determine whether they've learned it themselves. And the reason we do this, again, it's best practice. Research tells us that this idea of closure helps students retain information in a much more effective way than if we just said, oh, bell's ringing, let's get out of here, okay? And quite honestly, too often in my teaching career, and I was a high school teacher for most of my career, I let the bell determine the end of the class period. And I should have, if I was following best practice, I should have closed up a little early for this idea of closure because it would have helped my students maintain what they needed to know long term. Okay, that is an awful lot to have thrown at you here over the last several minutes. Any questions about what we just said? Okay, so we broke down the Hunter plan. It's not going to be the same terminology for every plan that's on there, but pretty much the components are going to be similar, if not the same. Okay, and so I'm noticing there's a chat here. I think that's
Yeah,
Brittany.
that was when I asked a question earlier, but
Okay.
I just decided to ask while it was still relevant.
Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do is I'll share the screen one more time here, and I will show you where to find the lesson plan assignment. Okay, so we're in week 5, but the lesson plan itself is found in week 6. Okay, so that's where we're going to go, and I assume that it's there because it's due in week 6, but that's where it is. The assessment 5, assessment competency 5, developing a lesson plan. So be aware that I'll show you this first. See the lesson plan draft here? That means that I'm asking you to submit something, some beginning of work. It doesn't have to be complete, but something that has said to me that you've begun the work, some sort of draft plan by the 26th, which if I'm not mistaken, what day is that? Today is the 23rd. So Thursday, is that Saturday? I shouldn't have done that if that's Saturday. If that is Saturday, I'll make it, it should be due Sunday night because I want to have Monday to take a look at it. So if that is in fact Saturday, I'll adjust the due date. But and then we'll have the competency 5 due on the 29th. And that may be a wrong date too. It should be due on the Friday of next week. So 1 week from tomorrow. And I think that's the wrong date. So I will adjust those dates. Look for that. That's my fault. I don't know what I was thinking when I did those dates. The lesson plan draft will be due this Sunday night. The competency 5, the final lesson plan, will be due the Friday, next Friday, not tomorrow, but the next Friday after that. So whatever those dates are, I'll adjust those dates. I'm having you do this kind of in stages, again, just so that we don't do this at the very, very end of the class time, so that you can get feedback, so that you can adjust things if they need adjusting. Because I want to make sure that you pass the competencies so that you pass the course. And that's the reason behind that. So let's take a look at competency 5. Here's what you need to do to get exemplary. Here's what you need to do to kind of pass it. I guess technically proficient is passing, but let's look at exemplary. The lesson plan is complete, so there are no blank spaces. You have all of the components complete. Whatever plan you choose, all the stuff needs to get done. Written correctly and explicitly. And so that's kind of, that's honestly pretty subjective on my part. So I want to make sure that you and I can have conversations about that if I feel like it's not explicit. So be very transparent in how you write it. Be as clear as you possibly can. If there's something that I don't understand, I'll just ask you, and then you can clarify it for me, is the way that it'll work out. If you can think back to the PLC2 class and you've been learning about Antonetti's cube and all that sort of thing, those components of engaging lessons, the front part of the cube, those are good places to start about how you want to engage your students, for instance, in the content of the day. The idea of the actual instructional content, you can look back into the Marzano stuff that's on the top of that cube, pull activities or strategies from the top of the cube, and then build activities toward those strategies. And at some point in your lesson plan, we really want you to get your students into high order thinking as well. And that's the right side of that cube. That's the Bloom's taxonomy portion of that cube. So if you can think back to that cube and pull one thing from each of those sides, then you can start to construct a very good lesson plan that's explicit in what you want your students to do. Okay, so that's how hopefully, and it would be so much simpler if we could meet face to face, wouldn't it? But hopefully that's how you start to blend these two classes. You pull from that cube in order to design your lesson plan. Okay, final questions. It's about 10:45 here. So final questions or thoughts. All right, so if you do have questions you want to ask and you just didn't want to ask them in front of folks, I'll stay on until everybody's off, but let me stop the recording here.